Good morning, everyone. It is just always such a delight and a special experience to be here. And it's lovely after being on so many Zoom calls to be in a physical room, even with just a few people. But of course, especially feeling the presence of all of you who are watching from afar through the magic of the internet. And one of the things I do miss about being in a in-person group is that afterwards, it's very common for people to come up and talk afterwards. And it's very nice as someone who is privileged, and I thank you. I really appreciate you letting my voice be part of your journey this morning. I do consider that a real privilege and responsibility. But when speaking in a room full of people, I can usually get some immediate feedback. And I hope that you'll consider this not just like a one-way thing where I'm kind of talking out there to everyone, but as a dialogue, and know that if something today really resonates with you in a good or even not so good way, you can reach out through the Temple Buddhist Center website and make this a dialogue. So I just want to kind of start with that. And before I get into the talking part of today's talk, which is called the In and Out of Transformation, I want to invite you, and I know we just got out of silent meditation, you probably just picked up your coffee, your cat's curled up on your lap. But if you're up for it, I want to invite you on a little experience, and if your hands are free, great. If not, you can just use your awareness. But I'd like to invite you to bring a hand to the chest and another hand to the belly. And eyes can be open or closed, and just let this touch, if it feels appropriate to you, the touch is optional, but let this be kind of a sign between your mind and body to just bring some kindness and gentle awareness to the belly and the chest area. And I invite you to just notice what's happening in these areas. Could be not much of anything. Maybe it's very neutral and calm. It could be quite active. Maybe you can actually identify and label an emotion. But whatever it is, just letting go of any expectations or assumptions about what you should or could be experiencing here, and just notice what is actually in the body in this moment. And knowing you can breathe into this area at any time. And you can also feel free to just drop this exercise and observe if that feels more appropriate. But I invite you to continue to monitor the heart and the belly as I say these words. Today, I'm going to talk about butterflies. I know for me, I feel a little kind of warm flush come up from the heart and up through my neck and into my face. It makes me want to smile when I hear the word butterflies. Maybe something completely different for you, but just noticing whatever it is. And then continuing to bring that gentle, that kind awareness to this area as I say the following words. Today, I'm going to speak about butterflies and white supremacy. And I know for me, real time, what I'm feeling is a jolt, a little surge right down deep in my belly of who knows what the source is. It doesn't necessarily matter at this point, but just noticing that that's the real response, and could be something totally different for you. And I invite you, if it feels appropriate, to take a couple of deep breaths And just let go of the hands if you had them on the heart and belly. And maybe even just looking around the room a little bit, wherever you are, tuning into the sound of my voice, maybe feeling the hands or feet to just sort of ground back into the room from that experience. And I just want you to kind of keep that experience in mind and whatever came up for you as I go on through this talk. So the germ for the seed for today's talk was planted a couple weeks ago when I was reading an article about caterpillars and butterflies and what actually goes into the transformation. And of course, that's just an archetypal image, the transformation of a caterpillar to a butterfly for any kind of transformation, for good reason. Any biologists listening, if you have a more dramatic example, I actually did a little superficial research to try and find a more dramatic example of transformation in the natural world as far as animals, and I could not think of or find one. But this article that I was reading described what actually is happening inside the chrysalis. And I was really struck by how intense it is. And in fact, one of the scientists quoted in the article, he used the term catastrophic. The change is so fundamental from this crawling creature that is bound by gravity to an animal that can fly, that really it's mind-boggling. That's what really struck me. And once a butterfly transforms, it's interesting to think about that it's not just suddenly that it can fly and that it receives the benefit of being able to cover much more territory than a caterpillar in order to feed, but in the process of feeding and receiving that benefit, it's also benefiting all these plants that can't travel by pollinating. And so it's this inward transformation that is so dramatic also has a fundamental outward impact on the ecosystem. And the other thing that really struck me about how deep this transformation is that scientists actually think that the nervous system, the nerve cells that make up the nervous system of the caterpillar, it's not like the body just reforms around this. These nerve cells actually disconnect from each other and reconnect in a new way. So, this is like fundamental transformation at a deep, deep level. And this is an intensely vulnerable process. And you think, well, gosh, why would nature go through something that intense, and what's the payoff for that intense vulnerability? Well, moving from being bound by gravity to flight, that's pretty extreme. And the way that nature makes this relatively safe, it makes this deep vulnerability possible is by providing this chrysalis. And I think it's fascinating that the chrysalis often is cryptic. It's a biological term for meaning it blends in, it's camouflaged, it's hidden. So it's like, the caterpillar can go away and completely release and be unbound at the deepest level in the safety of this chrysalis in order to later emerge and fly forth as a butterfly. So that's pretty profound. And it got me thinking about human transformation, small and large, and kind of moments when I have found a different way to do something in my life and the vulnerability that accompanied that. So I'd like to share a personal example. A few years ago, more than a few years ago, I decided to do a career change from corporate IT, this very intense, kind of competitive world, and go into education, to teaching English to speakers of other languages. And I was working with adults who often were of immigrant or refugee status. And, I had a supervised semester in a classroom and got great feedback. It was all wonderful. have my first semester out there solo. I'm like, here I am, I'm impacting people directly in a good way. I'm going into this caring profession. Things are going great. And get my first batch of student evaluations. And I'm reading through, and I get to this one, it says, I was scared to ask questions in this classroom. I feel that little jolt. But I think, there's going to be one in every classroom. You can't win them all. So I keep reading through, and pretty soon I get one. It doesn't say exactly the same thing, but the idea is the same. I didn't feel comfortable asking questions. There's that little jolt again. It's a little stronger this time. It's a little harder to shove to the side. And I go through, and there's a couple more. And at this point, for me, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Brené Brown is a popular speaker I'm sure many of you have heard of. She uses this term, the warm wash of shame. It wasn't just that. There were so many feelings, and they were all intensely comfortable. And I had to realize that this image of myself in the classroom wasn't quite matching up with how I was actually showing up. And that was a really hard moment. And when we get to those very vulnerable moments, very often the common coping strategies that we develop, which work well to some degree, that's a reason that we develop them. I had a choice to go into those, and one, which I initially did go into when I read that first comment, and one is denial, just kind of making excuses for why it's not really that way, saying, I could have said, they're students, they don't know anything about education, I have training in this field, so I'm the better judge of the situation. And that would have been, kind of dismissing the fact that these are adults with life experience and knowledge that's just as valuable as mine. And then the other common coping mechanism we have is distraction, right? Just kind of pretending it didn't happen, setting those evals to the side, saying, oh, you know what? My house really needs to be cleaned right now. Or some combination of those two. But I feel very fortunate in that at that moment in time, I already had an established meditation practice, a mindfulness practice, which had been building some important skills, some skills like being able to just stay with my moment by moment experience, being able to just see it clearly in the moment and just notice, there's shame, there's fear of rejection, of disapproval, there's all these things that were coming up. And to be with it without trying to change it and making it something it wasn't. And anytime we engage in any contemplative practice, we're building those skills. And in the actual difficult moment of feeling these tender and vulnerable emotions, those mindfulness, those attentional skills that we develop through meditation, those are like the chrysalis that provide a sense of safety in letting those things be there. And there is a happy ending to this story. I was able to draw on my community of practice at the time, my teaching colleagues, the academic research out there, what I had learned in my training, and just my own willingness to acknowledge, like, hey, I have a different way that I want to be. And I was able to gradually start showing up differently in the classroom, and I'm happy to say I've gotten really good evaluations ever since then. Students ask lots of questions in my classroom now. And so that really kind of showed me both the value of being able to open to this vulnerability and letting the old ways come apart so that new ways can reform. And I know some of you are remembering in the experience at the start, I said I was going to talk about butterflies. I've talked about that. And that I was also going to talk about white supremacy. And so just remembering, that feeling, that jolt, if that's what you had, or whatever came up for you. And just if it's starting to come up for you again, just remembering that even if this is your first day here at the Temple Buddhist Center watching one of our services, that you now have the awareness of the breath, the ability to just turn attention to what's happening in this room right now, to reground and to let whatever needs to happen. You have a way to create some safety to that, to open to that vulnerability. And so I want to direct this part right now more specifically to those of you who are listening and watching here who, like me, identify as white in the world. So to my white brothers and sisters, I think if you're here watching this today, you probably are already aware, but just in case, the evaluations have been coming in. And our black and brown brothers and sisters, they've been communicating to us that the evaluations are not good, right? And we can look at data, just look at data out there. And you may be wondering why I'm using the term white supremacy. You may think that's a little dramatic versus the term racism. And I'm using it very specifically because it calls out the fact that it's not necessarily just one of us individually. We're kind of like individual pieces of this bigger entity that we could call our Sangha, our spiritual community. We could call it Kansas City, our neighborhoods, our city, our nation, our state, our culture as North Americans. Whatever you want to call it, we're part of this larger system. And this is a talk for another time, but if you're interested in delving into how this idea of white skin granting special privileges on an economic basis, a legal basis, a political basis, how this has been baked into our system, I'll refer you to an amazing YouTube video by Jacqueline Badalora called The Birth of a White Nation, where she goes and she's a legal historian and scholar who describes how that term white actually came into existence in 1681. And so I'm choosing that term so that we can become aware of the systemic nature. Just the way that those nerve cells, those individual nerve cells in the caterpillar, they're part of the larger being. And so we're at a point where we need to decide, do we fall back to distraction and denial, which I have absolutely done, or do we decide to find the tools? And the good news is, if you are here today, you have tools. You have encountered tools, even if this is your first time or if you've been coming. You have the tools of mindfulness to create that chrysalis in the moment. But you also have the tools of the Buddha, right? The historical teacher, the inner wisdom that resides within all of us, the collective wisdom of millennia of human experience. You have the Dharma, the teachings that are out there. And there are so many teachings out there around what we can do to transform our culture into one where freedom is a reality for all. And the Sangha community, the spiritual community where we can support each other. And one way that I feel very proud of and very honored to be a part of is just this past Thursday, Victor and I were part of a book exploration. We're reading the Radical Dharma book and discussing about that. And we're meeting, it's a 4-part series. If you missed the first one this past Thursday, don't worry about it if you want to show up to the next one. And I'm going to quote Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, who is one of the authors of the book. When she was inviting people to do a national read-in with her, she said, "Hell, I don't even care if you read the book. Just show up, get into the conversation," right? And so if you want to join us this Thursday, we'd love to have you enter into this conversation, knowing that it is a safe space. It's a chrysalis where we can begin to be vulnerable, and in that vulnerability, we begin to open to the change. And we begin to let those old connections, we let the habits of denial and distraction come apart so that everything can come back together in something newer and hopefully much better. And almost every week when we come here to Sunday service, we say these words. We say, may all beings come to awakening, not one left behind. And that is the why. I've just talked about the how, right? Find the tools to make a safe space, learn to be vulnerable, to find a new way so that that transformation can happen. But why would we want to go through potentially this really uncomfortable process? Well, it's because right now, in a lot of ways, if we look at the larger picture, maybe individually, we're good people, we're acting in good ways most of the time. But the larger evaluation of how our society is functioning is showing a disconnect. And we're bound to the gravity of hundreds of years of suffering because of the way that this idea of skin color dictating who gets to do what has been baked into so many of our institutions. In fact, I would actually argue all of them. And we're bound by the gravity of that suffering. But if we can open to that transformation, to that vulnerable process, then we have the chance to form something new and find true freedom, freedom from that gravity of suffering that translates into real liberation, not just for one of us, but for all of us.